Hello and welcome to Cognitations, a podcast about cognitive science and how it can help us explore the wonderful quirks of the mind. Cognitive science is the interdisciplinary study of the mind. It is comprised of cognitive psychology, the neurosciences, linguistics, philosophy, social sciences, computer science, and more. Without further ado, here is today's episode.
Welcome to Cogitations. We are today's hosts. I'm Tanai.
And I'm Jay.
For ages, we've pictured our ancestors as living in small, equal societies, sharing everything around campfires without bosses. Think of popular ideas like the noble savage or primitive communism. But what if that picture is wrong? New research in the century challenges these old ideas, suggesting our deep past was far more diverse than we ever imagined. So what was social life really like for our ancestors? How does this new understanding reshape what we know about human cognition and culture? Are there any true human universals? Today's guest is the person to answer these questions, or at least some of them.
Here's Manvir Singh. Manvir is an assistant professor at the Department of Anthropology at the University of California, Davis. His research program investigates human behavior, focusing on the origins and nature of widespread socio-cultural traditions like shamanism, witchcraft, storytelling, and music. He achieves this by integrating evolutionary, cognitive, and sociocultural methods and theories within his research group. Previously, he pursued a PhD in Human Evolutionary Biology from Harvard University, post which he was a research fellow at the Institute of Advanced Studies in Toulouse. He's also a contributor to The New Yorker and has just had a book come out, Shamanism, the Timeless Religion. Welcome, Manvir.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. So, just right off the bat to start, so you're mainly an anthropologist, and anthropology deals in what we sometimes call deep history. Now, more recent history people will be familiar with and see why it's interesting and maybe even be interested in themselves. But what specifically is deep history and how is it a distinct field?
Yeah, so there's deep history within a history. So historians have become very interested in something called deep history, which is overlaps with I think what anthropologists are trying to do. Anthropology more generally is the study of humans, and that includes where we came from, what our evolutionary history was. And so our deep evolutionary past is of great interest to anthropologists. I think there are a couple reasons that historians and anthropologists and people more generally are interested in the deep past. One of them is if you're interested in what kinds of organisms we are, what was the environment under which we evolved, what were the environmental conditions under which we evolved, how were we shaped, what are our adaptations geared towards, then it really helps to understand the social ecological conditions that our species lived in for most of our species history, and of course the conditions that the species that gave rise to us lived in. So for some of your readers or your viewers might be familiar, but the general story is that humans and chimpanzees diverged somewhere around 6 to 9 million years ago, and then on the branch that would become humans, those are what we call hominins. And so for millions of years, you have the evolution of hominins in their various forms, and then our species is something like 200 to 300,000 years ago, 200 to 300,000 years old. And so if you're interested in why humans are the way they are today and why we differ from chimpanzees, then it's very, very important to understand what that evolutionary history looks like. My own interest, among my many interests, is really in what were the social and ecological conditions that our species existed within. If you want to understand our minds, our behavior, it really helps to understand the ecological and social conditions to which we're adapted.
A bit of a biographical question. How did you come to this interest specifically? Is the interest in deep history downstream also like temporally, chronologically from your interest in the conditions of our species?
Interesting question. Yeah, so my own backstory is that I came into a lot of this work through evolutionary biology. I was trained as an evolutionary biologist and ecologist for my undergraduate, and then I shifted into human evolutionary biology. And I found human evolutionary biology appealing because I find evolutionary theory a really powerful explanatory framework, but I find humans to be endlessly fascinating and interesting. The things we do, the cultural worlds we construct. Um, and and there was just something very enticing, intriguing, curious about having some insight into how humans work, into how our minds function, into how we cooperate, how we move, whatever, through some model of the past. And so I think my interest in the past followed my interest in the evolutionary origins of humans. It was supported by a kind of parallel interest in human diversity. I'm very interested just in all of the different forms that human societies have taken and do take. And so there was also something exciting and intriguing about getting some insight into human past by looking at the diverse myriad manifestations of human social life today, particularly looking at small-scale societies, hunter-gatherers.
Right. So this also seems like this is an interest that a lot of people in our intellectual history have also shared, and especially intellectuals during the Renaissance and the Enlightenment periods were especially interested in this question. I guess for people who are not really acquainted with the context of this field, why were so many intellectuals interested in this question as well? Was it for the same reasons that you described, or was it for other political reasons?
Yeah, so I think it was typically for other political reasons to some extent. I mean, there's an interest in if you want to make a historical narrative about why we are here and what in particular the institutions around us are serving to do, whether they are helping human nature or helping produce a more cooperative arrangement, or if they're harming us, then it is often rhetorically and ideologically useful to talk about the past. So a common story is something like, the human state of nature is X. The human state of nature is brutal and barbaric. The human state of nature is cooperative and egalitarian. And as a consequence, modern institutions are Y. Modern institutions, curb our brutality and promote well-being, or modern institutions are engines of hierarchy and despotism. Stories about human nature and the deep past become often political props or ideological instruments to celebrate or critique contemporary institutions. And so you find this a lot with, I mean, a lot of the scholars who really endorsed narratives about the noble savage, the
By the way, a quick interruption. Could you just quickly describe what the noble savage is?
Sure. Well, there's a collection of narratives, of images, of a human state of nature, of a deep past that are a bit romantic. And so the noble savage is one way of describing or thinking about those. There's also the original affluent society, which Solons had proposed this idea that before agriculture, humans had few wants, but those things they did want were satisfied, and they had a lot of leisure time. I forget the exact number. He said something like there were like 20 hours of work that hunter-gatherers engage in. But a lot of these descriptions and narratives and pictures of the deep past were emerging at a time when there was also a lot of criticism and critique of contemporary industrialized society, of capitalism, of hierarchical institutions, and they were serving that purpose. I mean, and then you see a flip side where people who might really want to celebrate or laud contemporary society, of the consequences of the Enlightenment, for example, might focus on the apparent violence or brutality of the deep past. A great example of this is that there was this book, Humankind, by Rutger Bregman. It came out a couple years ago. It was very popular, and the main argument of that book is that humans are fundamentally nice or cooperative or pro-social. And as a part of that argument is an attempt to push a particular image of the deep past. I mean, the dawn of everything does something similar. So in many ways, my arguments and what I think converge with things that Wengrow and Graeber argue, or Graeber and Wengrow argue in the dawn of everything. Nevertheless, as anarchic anthropologists, they want to push a story about the past that is fundamentally free. That, their story is that deep in human history, there were 3 freedoms that humans enjoyed, all of which we've since lost.
What are those freedoms, by the way?
I think I might forget. I think it's like the freedom to move, the freedom to decide your own political arrangements, and I'm forgetting the third. We should look it up. But again, I think they honestly have replaced. I think that's a great book. It's an important book. In many ways, again, I agree with a lot of what they're saying. Nevertheless, I think that in some ways they're replacing one idyllic image of the past, that of small scale, relatively egalitarian, with another, this like fundamentally free picture of the deep past.
Yeah, so in more recent decades, right, and this might or might not be as politically biased as, the Enlightenment and Renaissance views. But in recent decades, we've had this kind of very influential model. It's been, I think, pretty ubiquitous, that you've called the nomadic egalitarian model, and that you put into question recently. Can you describe this model, why it was so influential, and exactly what it says about the deep past?
Yeah, so the nomadic egalitarian model says that, well, it starts with the premise that humans have been hunter-gatherers, they've been foragers for the vast majority of our time on Earth, that the Neolithic Revolution happened, agriculture emerged 11,000 years ago. It took a very long time to spread. And so for, let's say we're 200,000 years, our species is 200,000 years old. For 90% of our time as a species, we lived as hunter-gatherers. And so then the question is, what did that social life look like? And that's where this nomadic egalitarian model comes in. And so the nomadic egalitarian model, I'm sure many of your listeners are familiar. It's this idea that for the vast majority of our species history, we lived in groups that were egalitarian, at least among age and sex, individuals of the same age and sex, that were relatively small scale, bands of about 25. There's hunter-gatherer research likes to talk about the magic number 25, and so that's something that's often talked about, that they were mobile or nomadic, that they didn't have storage, that they did not have property, or that at least resources moved quite freely, that there was a certain kind of more communalistic social life. And so this has been incredibly influential. This, you can time it essentially to the 1960s. There's a major conference that happened in 1966, this Man the Hunter Symposium. It happened in Chicago. It was a collection of hunter-gatherer researchers, and there was a real attempt to systematize hunter-gatherer research so as to inform our deep evolutionary past. And that is where you can largely attribute it. There was a volume that came out of this symposium. It was also called Man the Hunter, and there's a chapter in there in which Irv DeVore and I'm forgetting Lee's first name. I'm so embarrassed. But Lee and DeVore are the two authors, and they put forward this. They call it the nomadic style. And so that has then become the model for what human history looked like, and that has become very influential in evolutionary anthropology. So there, if you are trying to understand what human history looked like, there's a real value, it seems, on studying contemporary populations that exhibit these features. There's some sense that you study populations that exhibit those features. Those are better models for the past. But then also when you are theorizing about the past, why are we violent? Why, do we or do we not seek status? Why are we cooperative? Why do we exhibit theory of mind? All of these broad evolutionary questions about the origins of human psychology often come back to this nomadic egalitarian model.
Hmm.
Um, y- yeah.
Yeah. So, you go on.
Well,
I'll
you
ask
asked
one more.
why it had become popular, and um, in that volume, they talk about this as a feature of many of the hunter-gatherers that were being discussed and that were represented at the symposium. And Lee and DeVore um, were important, especially because they were working, Lee in particular, with the Kung, the Jute Wansi, who are one of the paradigmatic, quintessential hunter-gatherers of the 20th century and of anthropology. They live in the Kalahari, and they exhibit, at least in the popular scholarship, these features. They're small-scale, egalitarian, mobile. And some of these other well-studied hunter-gatherers were as well the so-called pygmies, the short-statured foragers of Central Africa, groups like the Inuit, Australians to some degree. Australian hunter-gatherers tend to be more despotic or hierarchical than the despotic is probably strong, but at least more hierarchical than the nomadic egalitarian model permits. But nevertheless, yeah, many of these canonical hunter-gatherers exhibited these features, and then since then, especially some of the hunter-gatherer populations that have garnered the most study, the Kung and the Hadza. Both of these are the extant African hunter-gatherers. There's some sense that African hunter-gatherers are especially useful for understanding the past. Um, and then some other hunter-gatherers that were studied, like the Ache in Paraguay, more recently, like the Agta in the Philippines, and all of these exhibit these features. So there's a real sense of like, you look at the world around us, you look at those hunter-gatherers that live in Africa in particular, but also some of these other well-studied hunter-gatherers, and this is what they look like. So this is probably a pretty good representation of what hunter-gatherer society looks like, and that's what our deep past looked like.
Yeah, seems like a small group to me, but that's just like a small sample of groups of hunter
Richard Lee,
gatherers,
sorry.
right? Okay, yeah, but anyhow, this is because there's like a cognitive science podcast. We talked with other guests such as Pierre Jacob about like the cognitive revolution, which happened around the same time. So you had like this kind of revolution where we did like psychology, linguistics, and all these other disciplines. Because they happened at the same moment, right? This so-called cognitive revolution and this nomadic egalitarian model being devised. Was there any like relation between the two? Any cross-pollination, or is it just an accident?
Oh, interesting. Well, I would say I think the nomadic egalitarian model really came to be incorporated more formally into, maybe I'm wrong, but models of human psychology in the late 80s and early 90s. I think about the canonical like evolutionary psychologists with capital EP, um, um, Tooby and Cosmides. I mean, even before that, you started to have talk, and they also really continued this and formalized it of the environment of evolutionary adaptedness. This idea that there is some environment, or there's some collection of environments, some representation of many environments that humans are adapted to. But Tooby and Cosmides, in some of their really important writings, really emphasized this nomadic egalitarian model, and that isn't by coincidence. John Tooby, his advisor was Irv DeVore. He was a PhD student at Harvard in anthropology with one of the major figures who developed the nomadic egalitarian model. I mean, many of the early evolutionary psychologists and big evolutionary anthropologists were trained in this circle. Bob Trivers was also an Irv DeVore student. Many major evolutionary anthropologists. Leda Cosmides was Bob Trivers' student, and of course she was she was hanging out quite a bit with John Tooby at that time, and she was also hanging around Irv DeVore. My understanding is that Leda Cosmides and John Tooby, the two founders of evolutionary psychology, actually met in Irv DeVore's living room. So, uh, 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 the move to really formally apply evolutionary theory to human psychology, or at least some of these major pushes and figures, was happening very literally in the same intellectual environment, where there was a deep emphasis on the nomadic egalitarian model and the use of populations like the Kung to inform our understanding of the deep past.
Right. I guess in to circle back to something you said a few moments ago regarding um, the typical method that's used to establish some of these features, right? You go to a contemporary hunter-gatherer population and try seeing what features they exhibit in terms of their social organization. Are there any other methods that anthropologists use to sort of assess the universality of these features apart from going to these populations? Because one could argue that, well, the present doesn't necessarily have to correspond with the deep past, right? Like there's so many factors that might have affected social organization today.
For sure. So I guess there are two things that come up there. One is just the recognition or appreciation that there are limitations with using contemporary populations to make inferences about the past, and that has always been the case. I mean, in that original chapter that Leon Devore wrote in whatever it is, 1968, I think it's called, what is it called? It's called Problems in the Study of Hunters and Gatherers. And so there is, even in that chapter, I think when they're putting forward this model, they even recognize that this is based on a limited sample, and that there are Pacific Northwest hunter-gatherers, for example, that seem to actually violate it. So I think there is a recognition that there are limitations, and that then leads to the second part of your question: what are other tools that people use? I think the big one is, of course, archaeology. And yeah, you want your models of the past as they're informed by contemporary populations to accord with the best evidence that you can actually get from the deep past. The tricky thing is, however, that there is a cycle where contemporary hunter-gatherer populations become models for reconstructing and understanding archaeological evidence and archaeological findings. So you can get, and there has even been a critique in archaeology. I can look up exactly what it's called, but like the Kung critique or something, the sense that we shouldn't be using the Kung as a great model for interpreting or framing archaeological findings. And so yes, I think there are different parts of evidence, also looking to non-human primates, to chimpanzees, but of course, like, a chimpanzee is quite, maybe it's potentially a useful model in understanding the last common ancestor with chimpanzees, but its utility is, of course, much less for what did human societies look like 200,000 years ago.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I do think, yeah, archaeology and probably contemporary hunter-gatherers are the best. But again, I want to be clear. I think there's a lot of recognition that contemporary hunter-gatherers live in a world where they are surrounded by agriculturalists. They are shaped by globalized forces. They have experienced a lot of cultural evolution. They have technologies that our deep ancestors did not. They have domesticates, not only, cultigens that have been adopted from agriculturalists, but also dogs. Dogs, emerged somewhere between 18 and 50,000 years ago. They are not part of our deep past. So there is a lot of recognition about the limitations, but the attempt is often like, okay, given all of those limitations, what can these contemporary populations tell us?
Right.
Yeah, we've talked about a bit about the methods and then how it influenced things like evolutionary psychology with a capital E and a capital P. But what other general fundamental lessons about the fundamental structure of the human mind has this model influenced?
Yeah, so I would say a couple come to mind. One is just the sense that we are adapted for a small world, that we are adapted to interact with, on the upper limit, maybe there's a paper a couple years ago from Brian Wood and Kim Hill and Rob Boyd and others, showing that throughout their entire lives, the Hadza and the Ache meet, maybe 400 people, but again, their band sizes are something like 25 people. So there's one sense that yes, we are the world that we currently live in is not one designed for us, one where we interact regularly with strangers, where we engage in large-scale cooperation, where we are cooperating with people just on the basis of identity signals, that this is very novel. There is a sense, and this has really been argued by someone like Chris Bohm, that there has been a lot of selection against aggression, domineering. Y'all might be familiar, your listeners might be familiar with the reverse dominance hierarchy model by Chris Bohm. This is the idea that chimpanzees have a dominance hierarchy, and egalitarian hunter-gatherers actively suppress dominance to the extent that they will even execute individuals who are bullying and domineering. And so the idea that there has been a lot of selection against that. Models of leadership, that leadership in these societies is often diffuse, decentralized. There's a lot of interest in what does warfare look like in these societies, and so you have what you might call two camps at the extremes, one of which really argues that when we look at the best models of the past, they don't have warfare at all. Others of whom argue that when hunter-gatherers live next to hunter-gatherers, there is some warfare. Yeah, I mean, those are some of the ones that come to mind. I think the biggest ones are just like how are we evolved cultural or socially and cooperatively, and stuff related to status seeking and domineering.
Fab.
Yeah.
I guess then, to switch gears, since we've been talking so much about what do you call the nomadic egalitarian model and its features, your paper with Luke Lowacki sort of challenges features that are put forward by this model, and you sort of marshal some evidence from archaeology as well to sort of challenge this view. So could you maybe describe what evidence challenges those views and what actually are those features where we have diversity?
Sure. So in the paper, we point to three broad domains of evidence. The first is the limitations of using recent foragers to make inferences about late Pleistocene societies. The second is just the amount of diversity that recent foragers, including those that are often considered great examples of nomadic egalitarian foragers, actually exhibit. And then the third is the entire topic of complex, what are variously called complex or low mobility or sedentary hunter-gatherers. So I can move through these three domains. Okay.
Please.
So the first one is, what are the limitations of using recent hunter-gatherers? And there has long been a recognition that some of these canonical hunter-gatherers, peoples like the Hadza, or in particular the Kalahari Kung, or the Inuit, do not live in the best environments. They live in what are sometimes called marginalized habitats. These are habitats where they've been pushed to from expanding agriculturalists. And this has actually kind of been a debate in hunter-gatherer studies. To what extent do recent hunter-gatherers live in marginal habitats? So Frank Marlowe, he was a big Hadza researcher. He and one of his students had a paper where they claimed to show that hunter-gatherers do not, contemporary extant hunter-gatherers do not live in marginalized habitats. There was another paper by Vivek Venkataraman and Andy Cunningham and others also showing that recent hunter-gatherers do not live in marginalized habitats. I'm kind of getting into the weeds here, but I think a fundamental limitation with both of those is they're using the standard cross-cultural sample, which only really looks at non-industrialized societies. So you're comparing like pastoralists, some rainforest horticulturalists and hunter-gatherers, rather than say the people who live in Tokyo or Copenhagen or New York, some of these great habitats are incredibly rich, that are where rivers intersect oceans. These are like incredibly productive environments.
Quick
Regardless.
aside, by the way, what is the standard cross-cultural sample? Since you
Yes.
that.
Sorry, great. Yeah. So the standard cross-cultural sample is 186 societies that have been chosen so that researchers could investigate cross-cultural patterns. They have been, there's, with any cross-cultural project, you run into the problem that of non-independence. yes, we find a pattern, but to what extent is that driven by the fact that these populations have interacted, or they live in the same part of the world, or they share cultural ancestry? And so the standard cross-cultural sample is one attempt to get around that. The issue with the standard cross-cultural sample, however, is that it either does not include, or it really is underrepresented or undersamples contemporary industrialized societies. And contemporary industrialized societies, like the places where agriculturalists have built enormous cities, are often in incredibly productive environments, some of the most productive environments. Like the standard cross-cultural sample does not represent the Nile Valley. It does not represent the Yangtze River Valley. It doesn't represent, I don't think it has the Ganges in it. It doesn't have that southern South African Cape. And these are some incredibly productive environments that like hunter-gatherers probably did live in historically, and probably built different kinds of societies. But regardless of where you stand in this debate, the more general point is that some of these canonical examples, especially the Kalahari Kung, have been pushed to a marginalized habitat by expanding agriculturalists. So that's one thing. Sorry.
Yeah.
That's like 0.1 of 10. So I think I need to like accelerate through these. Another thing that we really try to emphasize is that contemporary hunter-gatherers have been profoundly shaped by their interactions with agriculturalists. And that includes things like mobility and egalitarianism. So to take the Kalahari Kung, you look at the Kalahari Kung, or as they've been described, they seem to be like acephalous, so they don't have chiefs or headmen, relatively egalitarian. But if you go to some of the earlier descriptions, or you ask an anthropologist like Polly Wiesner, who has done a lot of work on them, she will admit that historically, before I think Swana headmen came in to Kung land, they had leaders, and they also had control of watering holes. They were territorial. They had corporate groups. It was a different kind of social structure that has been really transformed by the incorporation of Kung society into essentially a Swana larger management. There's also a lot of evidence that mobility has really transformed when hunter-gatherers interact with agriculturalists. So there's this great example, the Penan in Borneo, who are sometimes taken as this like archetypal, primitive, original hunter-gatherer. But in fact, the Penan's mobile lifestyle is partly an adaptation to finding forest products that they can sell to Chinese traders, things like birds' nests and whatnot. So this is something else that we have emphasized. Just that like contemporary hunter-gatherers, including really canonical ones, are I think much more limited than sometimes we give them credit. The second thing that we emphasize is that there's just a lot more actual diversity among even apparently nomadic and egalitarian foragers. They can have much larger groups sometimes. They have non-egalitarianism, especially like I mentioned, the Australian hunter-gatherers can be pretty gerontocratic, where the old men in some groups are incredibly polygynous and really like control the movement of young men and women. So that's another topic we go into. But then something we spend a lot of the time emphasizing is that the nomadic egalitarian model really ignores a large swath of hunter-gatherer diversity, and that is what has variously been called, like I said, complex or low mobility or sedentary hunter-gatherers. The archetypal examples are the foragers of the Pacific Northwest. So groups like the Kwakwaka'wakw, the Haida, the Tlingit, and these are groups that had villages in the hundreds, maybe even something like 1,000 individuals. They were quite low mobility, or much lower mobility than these so-called nomadic foragers. They often, like a big part of their diet was salmon. And what's notable about salmon, it's dense, it's reliable, it's rich. And so you can chill in a place, exploit it. You can also store it. So they had all of these other features, and then they were very hierarchical. They had ranked lineages. Rather than hiding the pursuit of status or discouraging the pursuit of status, it was institutionalized in potlatches. They have chiefs. They had slaves. It's a very different kind of hunter-gatherer society. And they are not exceptional or unique. You find similar low mobility, sedentary, stratified hunter-gatherers in parts of California, in Florida, in New Guinea, and very often you find them in these places that have dense, rich, reliable resources, very often aquatic resources. And what we now know, what we've really learned from the 1960s through archaeological research, is that you don't only find these in parts of the Americas when Europeans got here in New Guinea. They seem to have been everywhere. They were in Japan. They were in. There's evidence of low mobility foragers in southern Africa. There's evidence of low mobility foragers in Scandinavia. There's evidence of low mobility foragers in the circum-Mediterranean, including in the areas where agriculture would later develop. There was evidence of low mobility foragers throughout East Asia. They were much, much more common. There was evidence of low mobility foragers in the Nile River Valley. And so, and again, the thing that really seems to correspond is the dense, rich, reliable resources. When you have a lot of resources and they're high quality, you have individuals who buckle down, who create denser, bigger groups. And some of these get to prodigious sizes. You have, again, like New Guinean groups that were in the New Guinean villages that were at least 1,000. I forget, maybe a couple thousand. Vastly larger than the magic number of 25 that is so often emphasized under the nomadic egalitarian model. The tricky thing is, of course, how do we know what was going on for 200,000 years? Yes, you can find really great evidence in the recent world. And, during the Holocene, you can find really great evidence for low mobility foragers before agriculture got to particular places. But how do we know what happened for most of human history? And the honest answer is that it's really hard. The evidence isn't great. But what we now increasingly really realize, so if you go back to the 80s, when people are starting to recognize that, oh my God, there are a lot of these low mobility foragers. There's a book, I'm forgetting its name, something like Complex Hunter-Gatherers. I forget the exact name, but it's a really important book that shows them archaeologically. If you have like a hunter-gatherer expert listening, they're like, oh my God, how can you not remember the name of that book? But there was still this sense of like, oh, but it took humans a very long time to start exploiting aquatic resources. There was just this sense that humans have exploited terrestrial resources for most of the time. Now we know that's not true. We know that humans have been exploiting riverine and coastal resources for at least 100,000 years, 120,000 years, and they've been doing all kinds of incredible stuff. They have enormous shell middens that also would suggest low mobility, and you have this throughout Africa. And so that's also a thing we do in the paper. We say, we really try to review all of the really great evidence that has come out for all of the systematic exploitation of dense, rich, reliable resources, especially riverine and coastal. And so then the larger takeaway,
that struck me as when I read the paper as almost funny, right? Like, how would it be the case that for so long we just stayed away from water? Were we all scared of it, and all of a sudden we realize that there's stuff in there, or that we could swim? Like, it just doesn't make sense, really.
Yeah. I mean, I think it speaks to how hard it is sometimes to interpret. I mean, the archaeological record is amazing, and it teaches us so much, but it's like, how do you interpret gaps? Human history is always so much, there's always so much more going on in human history than the archaeological record can tell us. But I mean, I definitely get the effort to be parsimonious, only make your claims insofar as like the evidence justifies them. But the natural thing is that, like, every year we are learning that like history is often so much more interesting and dynamic and, complicated than we actually think.
Yes, sorry for interrupting there. So moving on from the archaeological data, which the old model just doesn't seem to fit, according to you, what is so we talked about status seeking and things like that earlier, which are like psychological phenomena that the old model gave explanations of, right? Why are these actually puzzles on the old model, and how does this diverse histories model give us some compelling answers to these puzzles?
Yeah, great question. And some of your listeners may disagree with me, but I think it's very hard to reconcile, just to take a very simple one, seeking and recognizing status and prestige and dominance. So under the old model, there's really an emphasis that there's a strong selection pressure against status seeking and bullying behaviors. again, Chris Bohm has emphasized that this comes to execution, as has Richard Wrangham in The Goodness Paradox. And so if there is such a strong selection pressure against it, then it makes it very puzzling that once you get out of low mobility foragers, once you get out of, high mobility foragers, that it's not only that humans pursue status, but that we are incredibly attuned to a world of dominance, of status, that we actively seek it, that we are incredibly strategic about how to get it, that we have a good intuition for status differentials. We can rank individuals. We try to attend to where we are within them. We are very good at attending to dominance relationships. I mean, we have a very sophisticated, complicated psychology for traversing these kinds of worlds, and so I think it was just long a weird gap in the nomadic egalitarian model. I mean, again, some of your viewers or listeners might disagree. I mean, I have gotten some pushback that like, well, no, there are ways to actually reconcile a nomadic egalitarian model with these kinds of behaviors. But I think just at a first approximation, it is very puzzling under it. So that's one. We can go through others, but
how does it work here then exactly, the kind of like solution to this puzzle, if you could walk us through it on like a
yeah. I mean, I think it's much more straightforward. I think it's just that there has just been a lot of diversity and variety in human social lives and human societies that reflects the variety of ecological conditions we were in, and in some ecological conditions there's a strong selection against this kind of behavior, but in others there is selection that would favor it. So when individuals can accrue resources, and I mean, it depends on what your model of dominance is, but if we have a simple model where I just can accrue resources and then it pays you to stay with me and take a subordinate position than to go off somewhere else, then we would have a facultative psychology that under some conditions, might be more averse to it, might be more egalitarian, might try to clamp it down, but in others might actively pursue it, might be incredibly attentive to it. And so that's kind of a, we're not saying it's one or the other. We are saying that it was both. And an important point is that even if you have a landscape that is overwhelmingly filled with low mobility nomadic egalitarian foragers, even if a very small part of that landscape has, if you have a landscape that is mostly nomadic egalitarian foragers, and then a small part of that landscape is these kinds of sedentary foragers, they live at such huge population densities, or they have the potential to live at very high population densities, that even, I have some math in the paper, I'm forgetting what it is exactly. It's like, even if 1/500th of the landscape is filled with these foragers, they would still constitute like a quarter of the population. And so the idea is then that even if they were relatively rare or small, just because of how large their populations have become, they would have constituted an important part of the, like, what we might call environment of evolutionary adaptedness, this composite of all the environments to which we are adapted.
So whereas the nomadic egalitarian society model gives us like more precise explanations that are kind of limiting, what you're saying is, oh well, look, just things are much more complex. And in fact, we're much more we can adapt to many more things just by virtue of how our ancestors were.
Yeah, and I think there's also been a recognition in the last 20 years about just how much more facultative and varied and diverse different psychological capacities are. I mean, just to take one example, there's all this really interesting work, and I've seen some pushback, but interesting work on personality, where we first thought, okay, there are 5 dimensions of personality because that's what you get when you study weird people, and now it's like, oh, actually the Chamani seem to have 2, and these other, depending on how many niches it might vary. I just use that.
You said weird people. This isn't a technical sense of weird, right? For our
yes, of Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic. Yeah, so that maybe a 5-dimension personality structure might be weird, confined to these like so-called weird societies, whereas, maybe more small-scale society might have 2 or 3. But I just use as an example of, I think, the growing appreciation for how what we might once have thought was a quite stereotyped psychology is in fact much more facultative, and more responsive to social and ecological variation.
I guess the flip side to that question would be yes, human psychology is quite flexible. But then, is there something that has still stayed on from the nomadic egalitarian model that still holds today, where our psychology is not relatively that flexible, in your opinion?
Yeah. Are there places where?
Yeah,
Are there
or like
places?
aspects of our psychology that are still like not as flexible and that come downstream of adopting the nomadic egalitarian model?
Yeah, that are better accounted for
Yeah,
by the
yeah.
nomadic egalitarian model. I mean, I'm probably super biased, and so I think no. But let me think. I mean, one might say just how attentive humans are to social consequences. So, for example, people find it pretty awkward to go on a subway and tell old people to get up. They're never going to meet these people again. They live, maybe you're visiting the city for the only time in your life. But people find it pretty uncomfortable to do that. That's not necessarily with the nomadic egalitarian model, but it is an adaptation for just a smaller world, not a world in the millions or the tens of millions, a world in which you being rude would eventually get back to you. Similarly, people don't leave restaurants without paying tips very often. I mean, some people do, but people find it incredibly awkward to do that. They find it incredibly awkward to ride a taxi and then close the door and walk away. So I don't think that requires a group of 25. I think that is still consistent with, a group that is maybe even low thousands, but it's it suggests that we aren't at least adapted to this world.
Right. So far in this conversation, we have just been challenging that there are any universal features, if anything. And we've just talked about how diverse human history and human psychology has been. I guess then the question remains, are there any true universals that scholars agree on that exist cross-culturally?
Yeah, I certainly think there are trivial universals. Maybe they're not trivial, but like language, music, smiling, I'm sure. There are numerous ones. Like joking, probably. Donald Brown has his book Human Universals from 1991, where he lists I don't know how many, and I don't think all of them have been supported, because anthropologists love to like find that exception and no. But I think a lot have. Yeah, I think there are quite a few universals. Yeah, I will say, just to kind of like spotlight a recent paper, and just because I also think it's cool. Kim Hill and I recently had a paper a couple months ago showing that lullabies and dance, which have long been considered universal, partly because of research that I have contributed to, are not universal. But I think these kinds of exceptions are often interesting or useful, because then they give us some insight into what are the processes behind these ubiquitous or near universal behaviors. So in that case, it seems to be that they lost the behaviors because of population decline and cultural collapse, which suggests that there's a strong cultural component to those kinds of behaviors.
What do you mean by cultural collapse?
So the story is that, so this is a paper about the northern Aceh. They are small former hunter-gatherers, small group of former hunter-gatherers in Paraguay. And so the bigger story is that I've done a lot of work on music, and more broadly, I'm very interested in cultural patterns and near universal cultural practices, ubiquitous cultural practices. And our research has really suggested not only that music is universal, but that particular domains of it seem to pop up very reliably, and those include dancing and lullabies. And what's really interesting is that those are not only ubiquitous, but they're also highly stereotyped. Of all of the kinds of music that we have looked at, dance music and lullabies seem to be the most stereotyped domains across cultures, acoustically. And so the implication is then that potentially there's something really meaningful there. If you want to build an evolutionary theory of music, it maybe like start with something that's going on with dance songs and lullabies. And some recent evolutionary work has done that. So we had done this work, and then Kim Hill, this person who has worked with the Ache for more than 40 years, he spent something like more than 10 years of actual, more than 120 months actually living with them, emailed us and said, "Oh, but I've never seen lullabies or dance songs with the Ache." And this blew my mind. I was like, "What? No way." Because, if many anthropologists say that, you're like, "Okay, well, have you done the work? Have you, like maybe you missed it." But Kim Hill has done more fieldwork than any other anthropologist I know.
Oh, wow.
He started doing work with them because he went there as a member of the Peace Corps. He has spent he's a very meticulous behavioral observer. He has spent many hours just watching people and noting everything they did. And so if he was going to say that they don't have it, he more than anyone, I think, is someone I would trust. But what's striking about the Ache is that the Ache have lost. So they're a Tupian speaking group. They speak a language in the Tupi language family. And you can do cultural phylogenetics. You can make a family tree of the Tupi speakers, and you can see, okay, ancestral Tupi seem to have had very complex culture. They had horticulture. So, they were small-scale cultivators. They had corporate groups, maybe some system of clans or lineages. They could make canoes. They had shamanism, something I'm very interested in. But the Ache have lost all of this. And some other hunter-gatherers, the Siriono, have lost it. Many of these, again, it comes back to the arguments of the nomadic egalitarian model. The Siriono are taken as one of these like mobile hunter-gatherers, but it turns out the Siriono actually were horticulturalists who then lost everything because their population went through a really severe bottleneck. And when their population went through a really severe bottleneck, their culture did as well. But then the implication of this, the theoretical implication, is that those things that were lost seem to have a strong cultural component to them. That we know that because the Ache, or we can infer, and maybe some people disagree with my inference, that because the Ache lost dance and lullabies along with these other cultural behaviors when their populations became very small, that suggests that there's a strong cultural component to those. They're not just like innate behaviors. We say they're more like making fire than smiling. Making fire. The Ache have also lost the knowledge to make fire. They still have fire. They keep it. But, if my fire goes out, I don't make it. I have to go like, Tanai, can I have some of your fire?
Right.
And so, yeah, fire making is also ubiquitous. It's widespread, but we know that because populations lose fire, there's a strong cultural component to actually knowing how to make it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you said the word earlier, and this is a perfect segue, right? So it is surprising, I think, and it will be to many, that dance, for example, isn't exactly universal. But you argue that shamanism is near universal, which also might be surprising, or at least that it's maybe, if I understand you correctly, like the most universal kind of religion, or yeah. So how does that go?
Yeah, well, so I don't think shamanism is necessarily more universal than dance, but I think shamanism is ubiquitous and widespread and near universal. Because again, the Ache also don't have shamanism. Yeah. They lost shamanism they lost shamanism before they lost dance, probably, or almost certainly. But yeah, so I've done a lot of work on shamanism, and there are a couple reasons I'm interested in shamanism. Again, I'm interested more generally in these complex cultural universals or near universals, and I think shamanism is a great case study. Shamanism is a very puzzling package of practices and beliefs. It's practitioners who enter these non-ordinary states, who heal and divine, who are understood to engage with unseen realms and realities. And I think when a lot of people think about shamanism, they tend to essentially primitivize it. It's wrapped up with this imagery that it's something of faraway societies, of exotic societies, of archaic societies. There's a very well-known book, Shamanism, Archaic Techniques of Ecstasy. Yeah, so there's a real desire to push it off and to see it as something very foreign. But in working on it, I've come to really recognize or appreciate that it actually is much more widespread and resonant. And there's this thing that I really like about anthropology, the saying that anthropology turns the strange familiar and the familiar strange. Um, and I think because of this primitivist bias that we've had with shamanism, we've often really denied the echoes that it has in other contexts. So, something in my book is that I argue that if we are very rigorous about what we're calling shamanism, if we're using these three traits, non-ordinary states, practices like healing and divination, engagement with unseen realities, and it includes not only the trance healers that you might find among the Kalahari Kung or the Sikere that I study in Indonesia, these shamans that I study in Indonesia, or Siberian shamans, but also Pentecostal pastors, many Pentecostal pastors, the kinds of neo-shamans that you would find at Burning Man, the Hebrew prophets, many manifestations or reflections or offshoots of Christianity have been very shamanic. And something I also argue is that there are many analogs. I wouldn't call them literal shamans, but they fill very functionally similar niches, like money managers. Money managers are promising to control an ultimately uncontrollable system. They compete amongst themselves to cultivate charisma to do so. They often really emphasize how different they are from normal humans. And so the larger story is that, our psychology, um, although variable and facultative, constrains culture in interesting ways, pushes it into these convergences across cultures that we can sometimes be a little blind to when we have our own cultural baggage and biases.
So in the case of shamanism, then, how is that our cognition is constraining culture or like leading to this recurrence of these set of traits that you just mentioned?
Yeah, so I think about there being three really important, we might say, capacities or sets of capacities that underlie it. The first is just what has variously been called a superstitious psychology, a magical psychology, a ritualistic psychology. So we are very prone to use low-cost behaviors or relatively low-cost behaviors to influence big outcomes. A simple example is sports figures who will like lick the bat before they go up to bat, or like they always wear the same underwear. But that is the same logic as fishing magic or gambling magic or black magic. It's all low cost interventions to try to influence outcomes that are ultimately uncertain, that randomly resolve in our favor. And there are really great evolutionary models that show how just like a simple bet hedging psychology can result in this. That I don't know if we don't have to go into it, but it's a simple example of what is called error management, where sometimes it pays to have a somewhat kludgy and error-prone strategy if over the long run it finds useful information. So that's one big capacity, but that is behind a lot of religion and ritual and magic. Another is just our sense that agents intervene in the world, that especially behind these kinds of big uncertain outcomes. Why does it rain? Why did I get sick? We are very prone to believe that gods, ghosts, witches, ancestors, fate, immigrants, doctors, whoever are controlling the uncertain in our lives, the government. Depending on the cultural context, who we attribute agency to will vary, but humans are very prone to do so. And again, I think that's well accounted for by a kind of error management logic, which we can go into. But again, that only gets us halfway. It doesn't get us to like the really puzzling, interesting things about shamanism. It doesn't get us to psychoactive drug use and costumes and music and trance. So to understand a lot of that, the thing that I really have emphasized is our sense that individuals can, what I call otherness or xenizing, the sense that individuals can do things things that normal humans cannot when they seem to differ fundamentally. And you can see this intuition or this logic in superhero stories. That's something I sometimes talk about. The superhero narrative has a character who can do things normal humans cannot. They can shoot webs out of their hands and fire lasers out of their eyes and control the weather, whatever. And the way that is made tenable to the audience is that this individual differs in some fundamental way from the rest of humanity. They were bitten by a radioactive spider. They have some wide-sweeping genetic mutation. They're actually an alien. Again, the exact story can vary. And so what I think, like what are the cognitive building blocks? It might be just about like how we think about concepts or entities and the traits that entail from them and how to get out of those. We can again kind of speculate more on that, um, but I think this is at the foundation of so much of shamanism. So much of shamanism is a performance, both to the practitioner and to the audience, that this is a different kind of human, that
Right.
this human has departed in some fundamental way from the rest of humanity. And again, the manifestations are myriad. It could be, you cut open my skeleton and the story is like new organs were put inside. I might have ritual birth. I might like go and be an ascetic for a month. I might like go into a hut and they treat my eyes magically until I am believed to come out with new eyes. Again,
Right.
like, and this is really interesting about shamanism is just the fact that in different cultural contexts, the ways that shamans are made other are again incredibly diverse. But what they so often share is this thing about otherness, and it happens both over the long term that I kind of transform into a different kind of human, but then in the moment of the intervention. And, if you came to me and you were like, hey, Manvir, can you talk to the rain goddess and bring some rain? And I said, for sure, stand back, rain goddess, bring the rain. That wouldn't seem, you would be like, what are you doing? But if then my eyes rolled back in my head, I started speaking some language that you never heard. I'm flailing on the ground. I forget it later. Sorry, I just hit the mic. I forget it later. If it's something that looks so distinct from normal human functioning, that makes it much more compelling. So I think this Zenizing is the really fundamental thing about shamanism. And I think the Zenizing echoes in modern contemporary societies. I mean, we have the same intuition, and it drives different kinds of performances.
So I just quickly wanted to reflect on this otherness aspect that you mentioned, where there's an emphasis on sort of showing how distinct you are from other humans. And I was wondering that with the rise of scientific beliefs in our societies, is there like a selection pressure on performances becoming so extreme? Like no one would really believe you if all of us are empiricists thinking, oh, there are no supernatural agents. So do you think there's this cultural selection that's happening on performances that shamans amongst us might be utilizing?
For sure. I mean, I think the shift in ontology that comes with a scientific worldview really transforms what the form of these uncertainty wizards takes. So you don't, I personally do not go to someone who enters a non-ordinary state to talk to a goddess or something to provide me with a service. But I think there are I think we nevertheless form similar intuitions for some kinds of behaviors. And one example that I write about in the book, which I've written about otherwise, is deprivation and fasting. So like I live in Northern California, somewhat close to tech culture in Silicon Valley, and that's a place where it's dying down now because I think there's a bit of a backlash against like weird charisma, but there was a big boom and efflorescence of like crazy deprivation schemes. Like there was intermittent fasting, then there was dopamine fasting where you don't look at a screen or eye contact. You don't eat food, which I tried. It's like incredibly boring, but all kinds of really like very peculiar deprivation schemes. Y'all might be familiar with Elizabeth Holmes. She started this company Theranos, and then had a tragic toppling after it came out that a lot of it was made up. But she would claim to subsist on green juice, just like a blend of spinach and kale and stuff. I don't remember exactly which. I remember nutritionists were like, this seems impossible. Like it doesn't seem possible for a human to survive on that. And that is the point. I mean, the same, what I find striking is that this is so often what shamans do. I mean, with the Mentawe, there's so much deprivation, both to becoming a shaman, but then in like when you are engaging in your practices, humans very often seem to have this interesting intuition that denying yourself cultivates some special ability. And so that's just to say that I definitely think science changes the forms that are taken, and it no longer makes some forms possible. I mean, there's an interesting thing historically where actually the church had really emphasized scientific explanations of ecstatic states to kind of delegitimize local prophets and mediums and competitors. But nevertheless, I think humans just certain intuitions are so strong that humans nevertheless come up with these new practices that have old echoes.
Could you give some quick examples of the church's explanations?
Oh, I would have to pull it up. I could pull it up. I think it was something like when you close your eyes and deny yourself contact, it like moves around something in your body.
Oh,
Sorry, that's like a
interesting.
terrible explanation. I can't even remember the here. If you give me like a minute,
Oh,
I can
no
pull it
worries,
up.
no worries.
But that actually reflects something bigger that I emphasize in the book, which is this constant tension between shamanism and ecstatic practices more generally, and with centralized authority. Like having shamanism and having ecstatic practice is fundamentally threatening for centralized authorities because it means that other people can engage intimately with the divine, and so you often want to quash it. And so the church's take over here is just like one kind of peculiar example. Who's the author? Kite, Keitt, Andrew Kate. I don't know how you spell his name. But maybe you can put a link in the show notes.
Yeah.
I
We'll
can
do
share
that.
it with you.
Yeah. So, have you found it, or should we
What?
put it in the show notes?
Yeah, let me find it. Oh, no, it'll take too
Okay.
long.
Okay.
I'll just
Sure.
share this
Yeah.
paper.
But on a like, also like, it seems like the way people talk about this stuff, it seems like things like social media and like the new like booming influencer kind of economy, that actually people we seem now to value people who aren't so extraordinary, right? The way people talk about this is, oh, everyone's an influencer and we like influencers because they're just like you and me. And for a decade or two, like blogging has been a thing where you just follow around somebody who isn't that extraordinary. I think this is in tension with this idea that humans are interested or follow people who are superhuman in some way.
Oh, interesting. I guess it depends on what you're going to those people for.
Yeah.
So I will. The first thing that comes to mind is that Sam Bankman-Fried. You know Sam Bankman-Fried. He CEO of what was it? FTX or something.
FTX, yeah.
Jay, you're not familiar.
No.
So he was a he did, I don't know the whole details. It was like you can invest your crypto with him, and like it's like I'm not entirely sure, but he had made a prodigious amount of money, and he was running this like incredibly valuable company. And it turned out that he was like misusing people's funds in really extreme ways. But there was a whole mythology about Sam Bankman-Fried. He had his downfall, I think, 2 years ago. Before it came out how nefarious a lot of his activities were. And the interesting thing about Sam Bankman-Fried was that the image of him that was publicly endorsed or pushed was that he does not understand social norms at all. So he had this hair. There was so much writing about his hair. His hair was always like everywhere and totally not managed. He wore like really grubby t-shirts. He's like worth tens of billions of dollars or something. He went to speak before the Senate or some Senate committee in the United States, and his shoes were like, they weren't untied, but they were tied in a way that like a first grader is still learning how to tie shoes. But all of this really promoted the sense of like, okay, this guy is like incredibly incompetent in these particular domains or inattentive to these domains, but he has a kind of mind that is unique and powerful and discerning. And after that, it came out at least that some of those things, like the hair, it came out that the hair was maintained as a part of his like weird public image. That's just to say that I think for certain kinds of figures, like especially these tech figures, where people are often betting on who has the unique perspective that will turn a company into a unicorn, one of these ones worth $1 billion, or a decacorn, one of these ones worth $10 billion. That really selects for this peculiar form of charisma when it's essentially like a kind of miracle working. You're looking for individuals who can. It's an incredibly uncertain ecology. And thinking about influencers, yeah, I think it depends ultimately on like to what extent are you relying on this individual to do things normal humans cannot, to give you insight, to give you information, to produce outcomes that normal humans cannot, to ultimately control the uncontrollable in your world. And I think a lot of influencers are not necessarily serving that function. Some of
Yeah,
them are.
okay. Yeah, gotcha. So it's not because like some kind of influence is becoming more widespread or democratized that like the specific kind of influence that shamanism scratches is also becoming more widespread or democratized or whatever. Hmm. Yeah. Um. But saying that, if I wanted to become a shaman, how would I go about doing that?
Yeah, I would. So here's actually a place where I kind of differ in a lot of the other commentators on shamanism.
Hmm.
My view is like if you exhibit these three traits, if you enter non-ordinary states, you provide services like healing and divination to someone, and you or the community around you understand that you are, especially I guess the community around you is understanding that you're engaging with unseen realities, you're a shaman. It's I don't think it's my place or anyone's place to say he's a shaman, she's not a shaman, blah blah blah. Like to have some kind of checklist of authenticity. You find that pretty widespread in a lot of the commentary about neo-shamanism.
Hmm.
Oh, this is like not authentic shamanism. It's not traditional shamanism. Um, but my view is that like this particular spiritual practice is so widely resonant and so attractive that yes, it has a pretty peculiar form in the industrialized West, as like so many things do. But it's still a reflection of a ubiquitous tendency, and that doesn't make it any less a manifestation of that tendency.
Hmm. I guess so. I'm being mindful of time. I think we are approaching the 1 hour, 15-minute mark roughly. Should we start wrapping things up in
Yeah.
that case? Yeah. So I guess, yeah, before we wrap things up, is there anything or any particular point that you would want to go over again or clarify that we discussed in the episode? Or are you pretty satisfied that we did a great job with this?
I personally am satisfied. I don't know
Okay.
if y'all want to go over anything.
Okay. No, I think that's a question for you. So I think if you're happy, then we're happy as well.
Yeah.
And then I guess like a final question would be, um, if a listener wanted to explore more about these topics that we discussed during the episode, are there any media recommendations or book recommendations that you would like to give them?
You mean
I
of
mean,
my own or of anyone's?
you could
Wait,
do a
wait, wait.
self-endorsement.
We can plug your book for you, so you don't have to do it unless you want to. But I've
Yeah,
read
so of course
parts of it, but it's really fascinating. That's what I'm gonna say. So please read it. Yeah, you go. You go
Yeah,
ahead.
so of course I think my book is awesome. For shamanism, I think ethnographies. I mean, I think my book is a great resource, and I think just reading a lot of the original ethnographies rather than. I mean, my book points to a lot of them, but maybe read Katz's book "Boiling Energy" on transhaling among the Kalahari Kung, or Tavi Yopinawa's "The Falling Sky." Um, Carmen Blacker's The Catalpa Bow. I think these are some really great ethnographies about shamanism. If you're interested in hunter gatherer diversity, I've had some essays, but even aside from those, if you're interested in something more for a specialist, there is there's Kelly's The Foraging Spectrum. It has two names. It's been published at there's the Lifeways of Hunter Gatherers, and there's the Foraging Spectrum. I'm trying to find which is the more recent one. Actually, I think the more recent one is the Lifeways of Hunter Gatherers. But by Robert Kelly, that is an amazing book on hunter gatherer diversity. Yeah, those are some
Cool.
resources I would point your listeners to.
Well, thanks a lot. I think we can wrap up here.
Yeah.
This has been Cognotations. We've been chatting with Manvir Singh. Thanks so much for coming on. This has been a great discussion.
Yeah, thank you for having me.